Let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked out of a grocery store and thought, that felt normal? When was the last time you filled up your gas tank, paid your electric bill, handed over rent, renewed your insurance, and didn't feel that quiet, creeping sense that something has gone fundamentally, structurally, terrifyingly wrong with the cost of simply being alive in America? Because here's what they keep telling you. The economists, the analysts, the talking heads on television with their perfectly pressed suits and their charts that point gently upward. They keep telling you that inflation is cooling, that the worst is behind us, that the economy is recovering, that wages are climbing, that the system is working. And here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. They are not lying to you about the data, but they are absolutely not telling you the full story. Because there is a difference. A canyon-wide, life-destroying difference between the story that lives inside official government statistics and the story that lives inside your actual bank account. And today, we are going to walk through that difference point by point, number by number, with the kind of clarity that no Federal Reserve press release will ever give you. We are going to talk about what inflation has actually done to the purchasing power of ordinary American workers. We are going to talk about what has happened to wages, not in the sanitized, seasonally adjusted, cherry-picked version, but in the lived reality of working-class and middle-class Americans who are watching their paychecks evaporate against a wall of prices that refuse to come back down. We are going to talk about savings, the emergency funds that were supposed to protect you, and what 4 years of relentless price increases have done to them. We are going to talk about housing, about energy, about food, about debt, about the slow and quiet destruction of the American economic middle. And we are going to talk about why, even as the official inflation number softens and the headlines grow calmer, millions of American families are more financially stressed today than they were at the peak of the pandemic. If you're watching this, it's probably because you already feel it. You don't need me to tell you that things are expensive. You live that every single day. What I'm going to do today is show you why things are this bad, how this happened, and what the trajectory actually looks like going forward. Because the picture is significantly darker than anyone in a position of authority wants you to see. This is not a doom video. This is not sensationalism. Every single number I give you today comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Census Bureau, Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and some of the most rigorous independent economic research institutions in the country. So let's start at the beginning. The inflation story they told you. The story that the government, the Federal Reserve, and most mainstream economic outlets told you about inflation went something like this. Prices started rising in 2021 because of the pandemic. Supply chains got disrupted. Demand surged when stimulus checks hit bank accounts. Businesses couldn't keep up. It was a temporary mismatch between supply and demand, and it would resolve itself once the world reopened and supply chains normalized. The word they used, the word that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell would later admit was a mistake, was transitory. They were wrong. Catastrophically, historically wrong. In 2020, inflation averaged just 1.2%, barely a whisper. In 2021, it started climbing, accelerating through the year, ending December at 7% and averaging 4.7% for the full year. And then 2022 happened. By June of 2022, the Consumer Price Index had risen 9.1% year over year. Let that number land for a moment. 9.1%. That was the highest inflation rate recorded in the United States since November of 1981. 40 years. 40 years without seeing prices rise that fast. And suddenly, almost overnight, it was happening again. And this wasn't just headline inflation on some abstract index. This was the actual cost of actual things that actual people needed to survive. In June 2022, energy prices were up 41.6% year over year. Motor fuel, the gasoline that puts your car on the road every single morning, was up 60.2%. Food at home, meaning groceries, the stuff you bring back from the store to feed your family, was up 12.2%. Think about what that means for a working family earning $60,000 a year. Think about the math. Not the abstract macroeconomic math, the kitchen table math. The math of looking at your paycheck and then looking at your bills and trying to make them connect. But here is the part of the story that the official inflation narrative moves past very quickly, because it is deeply inconvenient. 2022 eventually ended. Inflation started cooling in 2023, averaging 4.1% for that year. It came down further in 2024. By 2025, headline CPI was running at roughly 2.6 to 3%. The Federal Reserve began declaring victory. Financial media started publishing headlines about a soft landing. The crisis, they said, was essentially over. And here is what those headlines are not telling you. Prices do not go back down when inflation slows. Lower inflation means prices are rising more slowly. It does not mean prices are returning to where they were. When inflation goes from 9% to 3%, that is not a recovery for your grocery bill. That is your grocery bill continuing to get more expensive, just at a slightly less terrifying rate. And the cumulative damage of the 2021 through 2025 inflation cycle is staggering. According to data from Boston College's Center for Retirement Research, housing costs are up nearly 30% since 2020. Rents have surged 50% since 2017. Home prices have risen 80% in the same period. Food, transportation, energy, all of them up by amounts that working-class and middle-class Americans have not seen in their lifetimes. That is the real inflation story. Not the monthly percentage point fluctuations, not the core CPI, which conveniently strips out food and energy. You know, the two things that consume the largest portion of low and moderate income household budgets. The real story is cumulative. It is structural. And it has permanently, materially altered the standard of living for tens of millions of Americans. But now let's get to the part that makes this not just a cost of living crisis, but a wage crisis. What happened to your paycheck? Here is the argument you will hear from every mainstream economist, every government official, every Wall Street analyst who wants to reassure you that everything is basically fine. Wages went up too. Workers got raises. Real wages, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, are now growing again. The labor market is tight. Workers have power. The American worker is doing okay. And here is where we need to be extremely, surgically careful about what the data actually shows. Because the aggregate numbers hide a story that is, for a specific group of Americans, nothing short of a financial catastrophe. Let's start with what the official data actually says. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, real average hourly earnings, meaning your wage after you subtract the damage done by inflation, grew approximately 1% from January 2024 to January 2025. And from August 2024 to August 2025, real hourly earnings grew about 0.7% year over year. For production and non-supervisory workers, meaning the workers who are actually on floors, in kitchens, in warehouses, driving trucks, it was slightly better, at 1.1%. On its face, that looks like progress. And in the narrow technical sense of real wage growth, it is. But here is what that number does not tell you. It does not tell you about the 2.5 years before that. The years of 2021 and 2022 and into 2023, when inflation was running at 7, 8, and 9% and wage growth was not keeping up. The years when real wages were deeply negative, falling 2.7 to 1.4% year over year in 2022. The years when American workers watched their actual purchasing power shrink month after month, quarter after quarter, even as their nominal paycheck technically went up. Because here is what the aggregate 2024 and 2025 real wage data does not reverse. The purchasing power that was destroyed in 2021, 2022, and 2023 is not coming back. You do not recover from negative real wage growth simply because real wage growth turns slightly positive. If inflation ate 5% of your real income over 2 years, you need to see sustained real wage growth for multiple years just to break even. And even then, The prices that got locked in at those higher levels do not automatically reset. Let me put this in human terms, because the numbers only tell part of the story. The average American worker's nominal wage grew approximately 27% between August 2020 and September 2025. That sounds impressive, but cumulative price increases over that same period have been estimated at roughly 25%. So on average, and I want to stress on average, which masks an enormous amount of individual variation, nominal wage growth barely kept pace with nominal price increases. Barely kept pace. After 5 years, after what should have been a period of significant economic recovery, after a historic labor market tightening that economists said was giving workers unprecedented leverage. The net result, for the median American worker, was essentially a wash, if they were lucky. But here is the part that the average conceals. That 27% wage growth was not evenly distributed. It was heavily concentrated in the top income tiers. High-wage workers saw strong gains. Lower-wage workers saw nominal increases that often looked good in percentage terms. 5, 6, even 7% wage growth at the bottom of the income distribution. But they started from a base so low that those percentage gains translated to just a few dollars an hour more. And against an inflation rate that, for the essential expenses that dominate low-income budgets, was running significantly higher than the headline CPI number. The Living Income Standard for Economic Progress, LISEP, produces what they call the True Living Cost Index, which tracks the actual cost of a basic economically secure life in the United States. Their data shows that the true living cost rose 4.4% in 2024 alone, nearly 1.5 times faster than the official CPI figure of 3%. And since 2001, the true living cost has risen at a rate approximately 1.5 times faster than the CPI consistently. That gap, that persistent, systematic gap between what the official inflation measure says and what it actually costs to live a secure life, is not an accident. It is a feature of how CPI is calculated, which gives significant weight to housing costs in a way that many economists believe understates the real burden on lower and moderate income households. And it explains something that many working Americans intuitively know to be true. The inflation number they keep seeing on the news doesn't match the inflation they feel in their lives. And now, there is an additional threat compounding this picture. Nominal wage growth is slowing down. The rapid, pandemic-driven wage growth that pushed nominal earnings up 5, 6, and 7% annually in 2021 and 2022 has faded. By mid-2025, nominal wage growth had slowed to around 3.7 to 4.3% annually. Subtract inflation at 2.7 to 3%, and you're left with real wage growth of roughly 1 to 1.5%. That is not enough to recover lost purchasing power. That is barely enough to stay in place. And job growth itself began showing serious cracks. December 2025 saw job additions fall to just 50,000 new positions, a number that, in the context of an economy that needs to absorb population growth and recover from years of underinvestment, is genuinely alarming. Unemployment edged up to 4.4%. Companies, squeezed by the combined pressure of sustained high borrowing costs and consumer spending softness, began pulling back on hiring and, in many sectors, on wages. This is the wage trap that nobody in power wants to acknowledge. American workers spent 2021 and 2022 absorbing devastating real wage losses as inflation exploded past their raises. They spent 2023 and 2024 trying to recover some of that ground, aided by a tight labor market. And just as the labor market begins to loosen, just as hiring slows and unemployment ticks upward, inflation, rather than retreating to pre-pandemic levels, continues to grind along at 2.7 to 3.3%, with energy costs threatening to spike it higher. The math, for millions of American workers, simply does not work. And the savings, the financial cushion that was supposed to protect them when the math stopped working, are already gone. The destruction of American savings. Let's talk about what 4 years of inflation-driven financial stress has done to the savings of ordinary Americans. Because this is where the true depth of this crisis becomes undeniable. At the height of the pandemic, something remarkable happened to American household savings. Stimulus checks, reduced spending on services, and a broadly frozen economy pushed the personal savings rate to extraordinary levels. For a brief moment, many American households, particularly in the middle and lower middle income range, had more of a financial cushion than they had seen in years. That cushion is gone. Not reduced, not diminished, gone. According to data from financial research firm Auntic, the personal savings rate in mid-2025 stood at just 3.7%. That is well below pre-pandemic averages, which themselves were already considered dangerously low by most financial economists. A 3.7% personal savings rate means that for every dollar of income, Americans are saving less than 4 cents. That is not a margin. That is a wire. And here is the breakdown that reveals the full scale of the damage. For middle-income households, the people who are supposed to be the stable backbone of the American economy, the people who own modest homes and drive older cars and send their kids to public schools and try to save a little every month, cash cushions have shrunk by 42% since 2022. 42% in 3 years. That is not inflation adjustment. That is actual nominal dollars that used to be in savings accounts and are now gone. Spent on groceries that cost 25% more than they did. Spent on electricity bills that went up 40% since 2021. Spent on rent checks that ballooned because landlords raised prices to keep pace with their own costs. For lower-income households, the situation is even more stark. Even those who have seen relatively strong percentage wage growth, nominal wage growth at the bottom of the income distribution, was running at about 5.2% in early 2025, are facing a reality in which 61% of lower-income Americans are now regularly using credit cards to pay for basic necessities. Groceries, utilities, gas. The things that are not discretionary. The things you cannot simply decide to buy less of. Let me say that again. 61% of lower-income Americans are putting essential expenses on credit cards. Not luxury purchases, not vacations or restaurant meals, food, heat, transportation to work. Even among middle-income families, 56% are unable to absorb a major financial emergency without significant hardship. The Federal Reserve's own 2024 survey of household economics and decision-making, one of the most comprehensive annual snapshots of American financial health, found that only 63% of adults could cover a $400 emergency expense entirely in cash. That sounds manageable until you consider that this number was 68% in 2021, meaning that even as the official economic narrative has shifted toward recovery, the number of Americans who are one car repair or one medical bill away from financial crisis has been steadily growing. Think about that carefully. $400. Not $4,000, not $40,000. $400. The cost of a moderately serious car repair, a single unexpected medical copay, a minor appliance failure, a busted water heater. 1 in 3 American adults cannot cover that without going into debt or borrowing from someone. And these are not people who are making irresponsible financial decisions. These are people who are working, who are paying their bills, who are doing everything that conventional financial advice tells them to do. They are simply caught in a system where the cost of living has risen so dramatically, so relentlessly, over such a sustained period of time, that there is no margin left. There is no buffer. There is no slack in the line. Now let's talk about the numbers that should truly alarm you, because they speak to the structural, long-term damage being done to the financial security of the American middle class. Total U.S. credit card debt hit $1.277 trillion in the fourth quarter of 2025, the highest level ever recorded since tracking began in 1999. To put that number in historical context, total credit card debt stood at $770 billion in the first quarter of 2021, at the bottom of the pandemic contraction. In less than 5 years, that number increased by more than $500 billion, a 66% surge. It is now 38% higher than the pre-pandemic peak of $927 billion set in the fourth quarter of 2019. This is not a recovery story. This is a debt spiral story. Americans are not building wealth. They are borrowing against their futures to pay for their presents. And they are doing it at extraordinarily punishing interest rates. The average interest rate on new credit cards in 2025 sat at 24.84%. Nearly 25 cents in interest for every dollar carried as a balance. For lower-income households who are carrying balances month to month on essential purchases, this is a wealth extraction mechanism of breathtaking efficiency. The banks collect, the families drown, and the cracks are beginning to show in the repayment data. By the second quarter of 2024, 7.18% of credit card holders were delinquent on their payments, up from 5% in the previous quarter, and the worst level seen since before the pandemic. The 30 to 39 age group, the younger members of the millennial generation, who are supposed to be in their prime earning and savings years, are showing the worst delinquency rates since before the 2008 financial crisis. These are not economic abstractions. These are human lives. These are people who borrowed money to put food on the table and now cannot make the minimum payment on that debt. The housing vice. If the inflation story is the overarching crisis and the wage story is the engine of vulnerability, then the housing story is the mechanism through which all of it combines into something that genuinely threatens to permanently reshape the class structure of the United States. Because housing is not just an expense. Housing is foundation. The ability to live in a stable, affordable place is the prerequisite for nearly everything else. Job stability, educational attainment, physical health, financial accumulation. And what has happened to housing in America over the past several years is not a market correction, or a cycle, or a temporary supply-demand imbalance. It is a crisis. A genuine, data-backed, Harvard-certified housing affordability crisis that has reached levels never before recorded. Let's start with the renter side of the equation, because this is where the majority of economically vulnerable Americans live. According to U.S. Census Bureau data for 2023 and 2024, 49.7% of all American renter households are now cost-burdened. Cost-burdened is defined as spending more than 30% of your gross income on housing costs. Nearly half of all renters in America. That represents more than 21 million households, out of a total renter population of approximately 42.5 million households, who are spending a disproportionate and economically dangerous share of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. And that 30% threshold, while it is the standard benchmark used by housing economists, is itself arguably too generous. Many financial advisors consider 25% to be the sustainable upper limit. At 30% or above, families have almost no financial margin for savings, for emergencies, for healthcare, for education. Of those 21 million cost-burdened renter households, a significant proportion are what housing economists call severely cost-burdened, spending more than 50% of their income on rent alone. When half of your paycheck is going to the landlord before you buy a single item of food, you are not participating in the American economy. You are surviving inside it. The median renter household in the United States spends 31% of their income on housing costs. The median. That means half of all renter households are spending more than 31%. The overall situation, according to Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, reached new all-time highs in 2024. Housing unaffordability at its worst level ever recorded in the United States. Now let's talk about the home ownership side, because this is where the picture gets almost surreal in its severity. 75%. According to analysis from the National Association of Home Builders, more than 75% of all homes currently on the market in the United States are unaffordable for a household earning the median American income. 3 out of every 4 homes. Unavailable to the typical American family at standard underwriting ratios, at current prices, at current mortgage rates. Let me give you the specific numbers. To afford a median-priced American home, sitting at approximately $435,000, you need a household income of roughly $113,000 annually under standard mortgage guidelines. The median household income in the United States is significantly below that figure. 57% of American households, approximately 76.4 million households, cannot afford a home priced at $300,000 at current interest rates. And 75% of households, 100.6 million households, cannot afford the median new construction home, priced at $459,826. Since 2017, rents have risen 50%. Home prices have risen 80%. Earnings over that same period have grown approximately 38%. Not 50%, not 80%, 38%. There is a gap there, a structural compounding widening gap that represents the distance between where millions of Americans were on the housing ladder and where they need to be. And overlay on top of all of that the reality of mortgage rates. After the Federal Reserve began its historic rate hiking cycle in 2022, raising rates from near zero to a multi-decade high in order to fight the inflation it had spent a year dismissing as transitory, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate climbed from roughly 3% at the start of 2022 to over 7% in 2023, remaining elevated at around 6.6% through 2025. That rate increase alone added hundreds of dollars per month to the cost of servicing a mortgage on a median-priced home. The result is a housing market that is frozen. Existing homeowners with low-rate mortgages locked in before 2022 will not sell, because doing so means trading a 3% mortgage for a 6.6% one. This lock-in effect reduced home sales by an estimated 1.33 million transactions between mid-2022 and the end of 2023 alone. Fewer homes on the market mean prices remain elevated. Prices elevated and rates elevated simultaneously mean affordability craters. And affordability cratered means that the single most historically reliable mechanism for building middle-class wealth in America, home ownership, is now closed to a majority of the population. This is not a temporary problem. 52% of American families now lack sufficient resources to cover the basic, economically secure cost of living, including housing, according to LICEP research. Not enough to cover the basics. In the wealthiest nation in the history of human civilization, the American dream, as it was sold to generations of workers, work hard, earn a living wage, buy a home, build equity, retire with dignity, is mathematically unavailable to a majority of Americans under current conditions. And when you cannot afford to own the place where you live, you are renting, perpetually. And when you are renting perpetually, you are not building wealth. You are financing someone else's. The energy squeeze. There is an expense category that tends to get less attention in the mainstream inflation conversation than food or housing, but which represents one of the most insidious and unavoidable components of the cost of living crisis facing American families. Energy. Because you can choose to eat cheaper food. You can choose a smaller apartment. You can cancel streaming services and skip vacations and cut back on clothing and entertainment. But you cannot choose not to heat your home in winter. You cannot choose not to run electricity. These are not discretionary expenses. They are survival expenses. And what has happened to energy costs in the United States over the past 4 years is nothing short of a crisis within a crisis. Electricity prices in the United States rose 5.1% nationally from September 2024 to September 2025, nearly double the overall headline inflation rate of 3% for that period. Residential electricity prices rose 7% in 2025 alone. And since 2021, residential electricity costs have risen nearly 40% in total. Let me help you understand what that means in dollars and cents. The average American household spent approximately $1,850 per year on electricity in 2024. That is up roughly $110 on average from just the prior year. But that is an average. In the West and Northeast, regions already struggling with some of the highest costs of living in the country, the increases have been substantially more severe. Natural gas prices for residential customers rose 11% in 2025. Inflation adjusted, that represents a real increase of 7.9% nationally and 8.5% in the Midwest. Natural gas is not a luxury. It heats homes. It runs stoves. It is woven into the daily survival infrastructure of tens of millions of American households. And it is about to get significantly worse. In 2025 alone, utility companies in the United States filed requests for rate increases totaling nearly $31 billion, more than double the $15 billion in rate increase requests filed in 2024. These rate hike requests collectively affect 81 million Americans. 81 million people who will, in the coming months and years, see their energy bills climb even further. The reasons utilities give for these requests are real. The demands of artificial intelligence data centers are putting extraordinary new strain on electrical grids. Climate change is driving more frequent and more severe weather events that damage infrastructure. Transmission and distribution costs have risen 20% over the past decade. Natural gas prices have been volatile in ways that are nearly impossible for ordinary consumers to predict or protect against. But here is the unvarnished reality for a working family trying to make their monthly budget work. The reason does not matter. Whether it is AI data centers or extreme weather or infrastructure investment or commodity price volatility, the bill is going up, and they are the ones paying it. In Florida, the third most populous state in the country, already dealing with some of the most acute climate-related property insurance crises in the nation, utilities have filed $9 billion in rate increase requests. In Virginia, approved rate hikes will translate to an average monthly increase of $13.60 by 2027. These numbers, spread across tens of millions of households, represent billions of dollars being extracted from consumer budgets every single year. Budgets that are already stretched to or past their breaking point. Electricity has become, in the judgment of energy economists, the fastest rising major cost category in the American household budget. Faster than groceries, faster than gasoline, faster than vehicles, faster than medicine. The one expense you absolutely cannot reduce in a time when every other expense is also going up. What groceries are really costing you? Let's talk about food, because the food price story in 2024 and 2025 is one of the clearest, most data-documented illustrations of the gap between what the official narrative says and what the lived experience of American families is. The official story. Food price inflation has moderated significantly from its 2022 peaks. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that food-at-home prices, meaning groceries, increased 2.4% in 2025. Overall food prices, including restaurant meals, rose 3.1%. These numbers, compared to the 12.2% grocery inflation peak of 2022, look like a dramatic improvement. And in the narrow technical sense of the year-over-year rate of change, they are an improvement. But here is the question that the year-over-year rate does not answer. Compared to what baseline? Real-time grocery data tracking across major retail categories shows that grocery prices are up approximately 25.5% over 2 years through 2025, and the cumulative increase since 2020 is in the range of 25% or more across most food categories. That means a family spending $1,000 per month on groceries in 2020 is now spending $1,250 per month or more for essentially the same basket of goods. For a household earning the median income, that represents approximately $3,000 in additional annual food costs. Money that is not going to savings, not going to retirement accounts, not going to emergency funds. It is simply gone, consumed by the inflated cost of feeding your family. And the category-level data tells an even more alarming story than the aggregate numbers suggest. Non-alcoholic beverages were up 5.1% in 2025. Meats, poultry, fish, and eggs, the protein sources that are central to the American diet, were up 3.9%. Coffee and tea were up 11.8%. And these numbers come on top of the staggering increases from prior years. Eggs, which experienced a separate and severe supply disruption from avian influenza outbreaks, saw price volatility that made headlines nationally and pushed the cost of one of the most affordable protein sources in the American diet to record levels. For lower-income households where food constitutes a much larger share of total spending than it does for wealthy families, the impact of sustained food price inflation is not a budgetary inconvenience. It is a daily, grinding, impossible-to-escape financial emergency. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates that a family of 4 spending $750 per month on groceries is now facing approximately $500 in additional annual food costs, just from the moderated inflation of 2025 alone. Not the peak years. The moderated, supposedly improving year of 2025. And food inflation varies meaningfully by geography. Regional price data shows swings of up to 5% across states, meaning that depending on where you live, the grocery store is hitting you harder or softer than the national average. In many high cost of living states, California, New York, Massachusetts, Hawaii, grocery prices are running significantly above national averages, even before accounting for the cost inflation on top. The restaurant side of the equation is, if anything, worse. Food away from home inflation, the official term for the cost of eating at restaurants or fast food establishments, came in at 4.1% in 2025, after running at 3.9% in mid-2025. Restaurant meals have been getting more expensive at a faster rate than groceries for multiple consecutive years now, driven by the combined pressure of food ingredient costs, labor costs, and commercial rent. The result is a familiar and depressing pattern playing out in communities across the country. Families who used to enjoy the occasional restaurant meal as a normal part of life are cutting back or eliminating that entirely. Families who relied on fast food as an affordable quick meal option are finding that even fast food, the historically reliable refuge of budget-constrained diners, is now priced out of reach for regular consumption. A McDonald's combo meal that cost $5 to $6 in 2019 now costs $9 to $12 in most U.S. markets. That is not a perception bias. That is documented pricing data. Every dollar that goes to feeding the family at current inflated prices is a dollar that does not go anywhere else. This is the arithmetic of the modern American cost of living crisis. It is relentless, and it is cumulative, and it does not reverse just because the rate of increase slows down. Here is the condensed version of a very complicated story. Inflation exploded beginning in 2021. The Federal Reserve, initially predicting that the inflation was transitory, waited. They waited longer than many economists believe they should have. By the time the Fed began raising interest rates, in March of 2022, inflation was already running above 7% and climbing. What followed was the most aggressive interest rate hiking campaign the Federal Reserve had conducted since the early 1980s. From near 0% in early 2022, the federal funds rate was raised 11 times, reaching a target range of 5.25 to 5.5% by July 2023, the highest level in 22 years. The stated goal was straightforward: raise borrowing costs enough to cool demand, slow economic activity, and bring inflation back toward the Fed's 2% target. And in many ways it worked. Headline inflation came down from its 9.1% peak. Asset markets eventually stabilized. The official data began to tell a story of normalization and control. But that victory came with a price that does not show up on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, but shows up in your life.